Hello, hi. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. As I said, my name is Tudor. I live here in sunny Barcelona, not so much today, but generally. And I work for a company called Shipstead Media, and there I do mostly JavaScript nowadays. I work with VueJS, and I think it's an amazing tool. It's a framework that's really good, has some really strong points, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I'm going to start with a bit of history. So, by the way, who here does frontend? Quite a few. Question for those people. How old are you? How many of these do you recognize? Because if you recognize the first two, you should plan for your pension plan because you're really old. So the thing is, over time, we had a lot of JavaScript frameworks. And they started with Prototype, Scriptaculous, if you remember, was building these annoying applications that would slow down the page. Mutools, Dojo, jQuery. jQuery is still widely used today. And the problem with these tools is that they're very, very rudimentary. I mean, they offer just the bare minimum. Most of them offer some Ajax abstractions, some simple DOM manipulation. You just inject something into the DOM, or you delete elements. Event management, as I said, annoying animations. There are a lot of frameworks who do that. And shorthand methods, which, from my standpoint, is not really a good thing, because a lot of them provide multiple ways of doing the same thing. And there's one thing that all programmers agree on, and that is that the previous guy made a mess of the code base. And this happens regardless of the framework you're using or the language you're using. And this happens because we're trained to write code, not to read code. Reading the code is difficult. That's why whenever we find an already started project by somebody else, we have problems understanding, and we go like, we need to rewrite it, and then the project manager starts sweating. And that happens because frameworks provide multiple ways of doing the exact same thing. So I'm used to doing it one way, and then I end up with a project that does it completely different while using the same framework. What are the missing pieces of the old school frameworks? First of all, there's no real DOM abstraction or efficient way of manipulating the DOM. For example, most of the cases, most of the old school, so to speak, Ajax applications rely on HTML being generated at the server. You fetch it via Ajax, and you just insert it into the page. Also, there's no URL management or routing. I just navigate from one page to another, or I cannot do a true single-page application with using them. No state management, no support for reusable components, and as I said before, no coding standard and guidelines. To give you an example of what I mean, this is like a jQuery example, and you have this pretty much do the same thing. It's the way we're handling the events is very inconsistent. I'm not saying that it's hard to follow, but if you're used with a certain coding style, and then the framework encourages the shorthand method, makes it very inconsistent. And that's one, having this kind of inconsistency is the path to full-fledged spaghetti code. Also, the DOM operations are very inefficient. For example, in this case, this expects to get already formatted HTML from the server. So I have me as a front-end engineer, I have to go and do it on the server, or talk to the server, the back-end engineer, to do it for me. And also, whenever I upload, it's very inefficient, because even if something really small has changed, I refresh the whole portion of the DOM. So That was solved by using virtual DOM. This was the idea. Basically, let's say I have an initial state, an article ID, title, content, and the number of likes. I do an Ajax refresh, and then the article ID stayed the same, the title stayed the same, the content stayed the same, but the number of likes has increased. It was like a really cute puppy or something. So technically, in this case, I want just this part of the DOM to be updated here, just the two, to reflect the current state. I don't want to update the entire article. Why? Because DOM input-output operations to the DOM are fairly slow. So sometimes when you do these massive updates, you can see the page like disappearing and appearing again for a split second, but it's still annoying to the user. I want to have like a continuous interface. I don't want to flicker. And so virtual DOM was invented or introduced, which basically what it does, you have the state, it creates a state or an abstract representation of the DOM in memory, then just diffs it and applies a patch to the actual DOM. In this fashion, the DOM is updated in an efficient manner. Only the elements that have changed will be updated. More bad practices that you find with old school JavaScript frameworks. For example, keeping information or state in the DOM. The DOM is not a database. It's not meant for that. It's a tree, which makes it sometimes slow to parse it, especially for arbitrary information. And another architectural problem is, for example, if I have content that's loaded via Ajax, and I need to specify event handlers for that content, where do these handlers go? Where do I put them in my application? Because this, for me, is a component. This should be part of this component. Do I put them in the same Ajax response, and then I parse the response as JavaScript? Do I put them outside? What happens when this content gets removed from the DOM? Do the handlers also get removed? Short answer, I don't know. And after 6 to 9 months, your JavaScript project, which is cool and amazing, and it's going to be the next best thing, looks like this. And it's like, just go cut the red wire somewhere. So basically, what I want from a framework, from a JavaScript framework, I want pretty much what I want from a backend framework. I want good separation of concerns. That's one of the most important features of the framework, because if it offers that, I can use it, and my project will be maintainable in time. Otherwise, it's just going to become the spaghetti code from the previous slide. I want virtual DOM. I want operations to the DOM to be efficient. I want in-memory state management. I don't want to look for information from the DOM, and I want to have access to in the memory. It's really fast. I want to have fast operations. I want routing, preferably using the HTML5 history API. And I want to have clear coding practices and Ajax. I want to have an Ajax abstraction layer, although that is not necessarily a deal breaker, because there are a lot of really good Ajax libraries, like promise-based Ajax libraries that you can just plug in into everything, and allows your framework to focus on what's really important while you can pick the best Ajax library for you. So, by the way, I'm not sure this is React. Mostly there were frameworks that already addressed these issues and solved them. And in the front-end JavaScript framework arena, now the main fight is between React, which is supported by Facebook, and Angular, which is supported by Google. So you have these two tech giants and two frameworks, and I think 80% of the JavaScript engineers use one or the others. And there are several, Ember, Knockout, Riot, backbone, if you like it really lightweight. And where does Vue fit in all of this, and why should anybody consider Vue? First of all, it's really lightweight. It has the smallest footprint of when you compare it with the other two big frameworks, with Angular and or React. It's a true open source project. It's developed by a community, not by a tech giant. I don't know if you're aware, but until like a few weeks ago, React had this problem with their licensing. Basically, if you were using React in your application, you would forfeit your rights to sue Facebook for whatever. So this will not happen with Vue. I also think it has the fastest learning curve. So if you want to move to a modern JavaScript framework, I think VueJS will be the fastest choice. Will be the fastest to get you to production because it supports. It just uses things that you already know. So it doesn't use complicated JSX syntax. It just uses a clear. A more clearer syntax that people are familiar with. Separation of concerns in one file. Basically, Vue relies on components, and components are one component per file. So if you want to change a component, you go to that file, you edit only that file, you commit it, that's it. And great performance per kilobyte. This is a metric I invented when doing the slides. Here are some comparison graphs between Vue, React, and Angular. There is the source. I didn't do them myself. And generally, the smaller number is the better one. As you can see, in some cases, Vue wins. In some cases, it loses, but it's in the same range as Angular and React when it comes to performance. There's no massive spike, but there's also no massive loss. Although when we look at the file size, Vue actually wins because it's by far the smallest. And for front-end file size, it's important. I want the download to be fast, especially, for example, in my company. We're a multinational corporation, and we have offices, and we serve customers in countries where the internet connections are generally slower. So, for example, if you live, in Spain or Germany, or the 50 kilos is not going to be that much. But if you live in Belarus, it can be slower. So, and also a larger file size means it takes more time for the browser to parse it initially. So small, it's better. And basically, I'm going to go and talk about the architecture of a Vue application. And it's built on components. In Vue, everything is a component. It's very similar to React in some fashion. And basically, what components are custom HTML elements that have behavior attached to them. So imagine I create an element, which is a menu item. And whatever this menu item does, it's incorporated within the file of the menu item. How it acts when it's selected, how it acts when it's deselected, how does it publish events telling that was selected or not, and so on. Everything is encapsulated in that file. That's making the components self-contained. They reside in .vue files, which are compiled with Webpack or Browserify. Personally, I've never used Browserify. For some reason, I don't like it. Don't want to start a flame war, though. So just when in doubt, use Webpack. Can be mixed with regular HTML. So you basically write your HTML normally, and when you need something fancier, you can just pop in a Vue component there, and it will do its magic. And the Vue application, it's wrapped in a root component. So imagine to some extent, it mimics the structure of an HTML page. You have the root component, which would be the HTML element, or the body element if you want, and all the other elements go into this element. The same happens in Vue. You have a root component, and all the other components go into that element. So, for example, I would have a menu item, a simple page where I have a menu, some menu items components, some can be selected or not. I have a content and a footer. Very simple page. Basically, I'm just taking the wiremocks of the page and put them into Vue components. And how will a component look like? This is an actual Vue component. In this case, would be the middle one, the content component. Basically, it has three main parts: a template, script, and style. In the template part, I write the HTML for this component. And it uses a mustache-like syntax. So, for example, I want to write the title here. I want to write the article. I want to display if it's loaded. I want to display this part. If it's not loaded, I want to display the loading message. And then I have the actual script part, which is the logic of the component, what the component does, or what the component knows to do. And the most important part is these so-called reactive properties. What does a reactive property mean? Whenever that property is changed, it triggers a re-render of the template. So, for example, if I change the title, this part will be re-rendered. If I change the media URL, this part will be re-rendered. The thing is, it doesn't re-render the entire component. It just uses virtual DOM and only renders the elements that have changed. So, for example, in my case, if I change the title, it will only change the content of the first header and the alternative text of the image. Nothing else in the DOM will change. Now, if you look in the syntax, for example, HTML attributes that link to a reactive property need to have these two dots in front of them. This tells the Vue engine this links to a reactive property. Add it to your virtual DOM. If that changes, I want this to be changed. If you don't put it here, it will be interpreted literally. So, and then, as with any other framework, I have some lifecycle events. For example, mounted is an event that gets fired whenever the component has been mounted into the DOM and has become visible. So in that case, I would just perform an AJAX call. And with the response, I would just put it in the reactive properties in my data. I would say loaded is true, media article, and this will trigger automatically a re-render of the main, of the template, of the main visible part of the template, of the component. And I also have a style part, which is basically clear CSS, but it also supports out-of-the-box preprocessors for CSS, such as less or Sass. Again, don't use less. Yeah, I know. So, is anybody using less? Oh, wait. I'm just going to stop saying that. Note to self, yeah. No. Okay, so basically what can I use reactive properties? I can use them to show or hide elements. By the way, show or hide means it's not necessarily hidden, means it's completely removed from the DOM. It doesn't exist. We can also just hide them by setting the visibility hidden or display none. there is something called vShow for that. But vIf means if this expression here evaluates to false, everything else gets removed from the DOM, which is good because at some point, if you have a lot of browser pages and a lot of tabs open and memory-hungry browser can get really slow if the DOM is really big. So I want to keep in the DOM only the parts that are actually required at the moment. And then I can just add, remove others. I can also use the reactive properties to fill in HTML elements or to set values for an HTML attribute. And as I said before, changing any of the values here will trigger a re-render in the template. And there are also another set of reactive components called computed properties. Basically, what computed properties mean as opposed to the normal, let's say, properties, these are functions and allow me to encapsulate sometimes a more complex logic. So, for example, in my case, I want to decide whether this is loaded, and means the title is null and the article is null, but I can add more complex logic, such as no error has occurred, or I can do whatever I want. This is a function that gets called, and its result gets cached. So even if I use it multiple times in the template, this will only be called once. So you can do however complex operations here. And if any of its dependencies change, this will be reevaluated, and the template will act accordingly. So if at some point I set, after this has returned true, so I have a title and a article body, if I set this to null, this will be reevaluated and the DOM will disappear. It will go on the loading part. So as I said before, this is how a template looks like, a more complex template. Basically, computed properties can be anything. You can return a string, you can return a Boolean, you can return whatever you want, an object, and so on. Also I can iterate with a mustache-like syntax through items in an array. So for example, here I have a list of articles in related articles, and I have each article has a URL and a text, and then I create a loop, and I display the URL and the text. And in order to add, to listen for events, because it's really important at the end, it's front end, so it's interaction with the user. Events are probably the most important thing. Events are added in the template. You can say v-on, click, and then you can call a function. And in the Vue, in the script part of the Vue component, I have methods field, where I can declare methods that I can call from the template. And now, for example, when the user clicks on this element, this method gets called, show related is switched from true to false, and this triggers the render of this, like show related articles or not, and the same because this property has changed, this gets reevaluated and will show one message or the other based on whether you're on true or false. And why HTML event handlers? Because for years we've been told, don't do that, don't do like on click or on mouse over. It's so Netscape Navigator, it's so, 98. Well, the thing is, it's easier to locate the handlers just by skimming through the template. You just look and you see on click, okay, something happens here. I don't know if you've had the misfortune of looking into a really, legacy JavaScript application where you click on something, a handler is called, but you don't know where that handler is set, because it can be set on that element, can be set on a different file, can be set upper in the DOM tree and rely on event bubbling and so on, which made it difficult. Sometimes just identifying what gets called, I needed to use the debugger and see what event handlers are added to that element, where are they in my 30-something files application. So here, all the events that are related to this component are in the template of the component, so it's really easy to find them. It's also easy to test the underlying logic because it's completely separated from the DOM. I can easily unit test it. I don't have to mock events in my unit test in order to test the logic. So for example, if I want to test this component, I can just import in my test the script part and call this method, and then I can check that the toggle has changed correctly without actually having to fire an event. And one cool thing is they can automatically be removed whenever the DOM is removed. So Vue internally will do the event management for you. If you add an event listener, it will add it to the DOM. When you remove that DOM, automatically it removes all the handlers. So you don't have memory leaks. You don't have handlers listening for events from elements that no longer exist in the DOM. So for example, how would a minimalistic Vue JS application would look like? If you remember, I said that everything is a component. So you have a root component. Generally, in the VueJS coding practices, you call that app.vue. And then you have a main, which is the bootstrap script. This is the entry point of the application where you import the view, you import the application, and then you create a new Vue application, and you specify where to be added in the DOM. So basically, you create an empty HTML page with a div or something where you want your VueJS application to go, and then you bootstrap the application and you pass that element, and that element will be replaced with the actual Vue generated code. This is very similar to how React works, for example. And I can, in my application, in my root component, I can import and use other components. And I use them with a HTML-like syntax. So for example, I import the menu item, I import the content, I import the footer, and then I specify how the tag should look, and then I use it here. And components' name are generally camel-cased, and these are, I think it's called kebab-cased, or something where you have the minuses in between. So in the HTML part, I would have menu item with the dash, and here I would have menu item camel-cased. And it's like, how do you communicate data between a component and its children component, or from a child component to its parent? Given that each part of my application is an individual Vue component, sometimes they need to communicate with each other. So Vue implements a pattern with two-way data communication, where parents inject values via HTML attributes. You can send information to the children, and children push custom events to the parent using the Vue on custom event name, whatever you call it. To give you an example, in my app, I use the menu item, okay? And now the menu item encapsulates all the logic on how it looks and how it acts. For example, the parent can tell it, this is the menu item for ID 1, and the label should be books. Book. And then, whether it's a link, whether it's a button, whether it's a checkbox that you have to check, this is the parent is agnostic to how with regards to the internal workings of the child component. So everything that is a menu item and everything a menu item does is encapsulated within the menu item component. So basically, I need to be able to inject data and get events out of it. And I can declare properties. For example, this menu item will have the properties ID, label, and whether it's selected or not. Again, the logic or what is selected or what is not selected is encapsulated in the menu item component. Basically, the set of properties is a contract between the child component and the parent, and says, these are the things that I understand. If you give me this information, I can work with them, and I can provide visual cues to the user on whether the element is selected or not, or what the element is about. And at some point, I also need to send the information back to the parent. I need, like, somebody has clicked on the menu item, so whether it's a list item with a link in it or a button or whatever, the menu was selected somehow. I have logic in the component to make sure that was selected. And now I need to publish that information. I need to send it back to the parent because the parent needs to act on it. So I can use, whenever this was clicked, I can emit an event. I can say selected, and I can send a payload of the event. What was selected? What component am I? And here I can listen for that custom event in the parent and say, if this was selected, called process. And in the event object, I have the payload that was sent here. So this allows me to fully isolate one component from the components next to it or from the parent component. I have, and this makes it really easy to test. The component is self-contained. It has everything it needs to function. And sometimes I need more, when information changes from the parent. So let's say, for example, I get something injected from the parent via a property. I need to do something in a component. Properties are also reactive components. So when you change a property, it triggers automatically a re-render of the template. But sometimes I need to do more than just re-render the template. If let's say, in my content, whenever the parent specifies a new ID, I need to display the content for that ID. So I need to go to the server, do an AJAX call, get the article, and display it in the template. So basically, Vue has the so-called watchers. In Vue, everything can be watched. So you can add a watcher on every variable. It's like it was built by the NSA. So everything you can just spy on it. And whenever the article ID has changed, this function gets executed, where I get the current value and the previous one. In this case, I don't care about the previous one. And I do a AJAX call, fetch that value, and then when the response comes back, I populate the title and the article, and this will refresh the template with the new data. So basically, let's say this is my main application, to give you like a unified view on how this would actually function. We have the app.view, and then I have some elements. And whenever one is clicked, this method gets executed. This changes the value of the article ID, which is a reactive property, which in turn changes the template here. And because this has changed, this is information that goes into the content component, which will be intercepted by the watcher and will trigger the refresh with the new information. So, for example, in this case, again, if you see, everything is encapsulated. However the content is being loaded, it's encapsulated in the content component. There's nothing from outside. From the outside, I just say, load article 1, load article 2. That's it. How it loads it, from where, and so on, everything is encapsulated in the content. How the response from the server is being parsed, whether it's JSON or XML or whatever, it's encapsulated here. So this makes it really easy to maintain and refactor. If I have a new type of response from the server, I just edit one file, and that's it. And at some point in a true single-page application, you need routes. You need the stateful URLs. So, for example, if I click on 2-3 buttons and I load new content in the page, I copy-paste the URL and send it over WhatsApp or something to a friend, I expect that friend to see the exact same things that I see. So I need, whenever I do an AJAX operation, I need to update the URL. I need to have stateful URLs. The URL should reflect the content of the page. And this is a client-side router. It comes as a separate package. It's not bundled with Vue. You need to install it, and supports both HTML5 history API, which provides you with true URLs, or uses the hash sign as a fallback, where you have your file hash and then the Vue URL. And installing the Rueter is like a 3-steps process. First, you need to create a file, router.js, where you define the routes. For example, when I'm in the root, this will be called the home route and will load the component homepage. And then in my main, in the Bootstrap script, if you remember, this is the entry point in Vue, I need to import this file and specify it here that this application needs to use this router. And in the template, I can add a router view. And whenever the user clicks on something and navigates to a different page, the component that's linked to that URL is loaded here. So you can have multiple pages being loaded by navigating without actually refreshing the page and hitting the server again. It also supports dynamic routes. I don't know if you can see. Which is, article or ID. For example, you can specify route params, nested routes, programmatic navigation. So, for example, you can navigate to a new route after 5 seconds or something. You don't need to wait necessarily for the user to click on something, and allow adding watchers on routes. So, for example, if this kind of fill in the component here when the route change is not powerful enough for what I need to do, I can just add a router on the watcher on the route, and whenever the route changes, I get the current route, the previous route, and then I can do whatever I want. I'm not going to spend much more time on the router because it does pretty much what any other server-side or client-side router does. If you've used the router, you've used them all. And I'm going to move to something called VueJS. This is Vue's response to Redux. Basically what it does, by the way, this is the actual illustration from their website. I stole it from there. So basically what it does, it provides a state store for the application. Because sometimes I have multiple components that need to react to a state change. So if something has changed, I need to propagate that change into multiple components. And basically, Vuex provides me with that. It has actions that are dispatched as a result from. So for example, let's say I click on Hello? Okay. This looks very hip-hoppy, so. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what to do with my hands now, so thank you for that. Anyway. Okay, so I have mutations, and what does a mutation mean? It's a change of the state. Whenever I change the state, I call a mutation. And now I have in the Vuex module, I have the state, which is I have 3 variables in the state. Whenever one of these variables changes, means something has happened in my application. And I want the components to re-render. So for example, I have loading, means I'm starting to load something from the server. So I want the components to display like those spinners or something. I have an error, whether an error has occurred. Sometimes I cannot fetch from the server. It's like the network is off and so on. And I want to display an error to the user. And my actual article, the thing that I'm loading from the server. And I have mutations. For example, when I start fetching, I assume that the loading is true, and there's no error. If the fetch was a success, I have no error, the loading is false, and I have an article. And if there's an error, I've finished loading, there's no more loading happening, and the error is true. And then I have an action, which is load, received an article ID. Initially, it commits the fetch start. So I'm starting to display the spinners or whatever. I do the AJAX request. If the request is successful, I commit it. I commit a fetch success. Or if there's an error, I fetch an error. And there are some limitations. In the mutations need to be synchronous. So you cannot have asynchronous code in the mutation. Why? Because this changes the state. And whenever you change the state, your other components start reloading. So you don't want to have half a state. You're either loading or you have finished loading. So it needs to be very atomic. Actions, on the other hand, can be asynchronous, and they end with a mutation. So I call an asynchronous operation, I finish it, and then I commit the change in the state. I have like 5 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to try to do the Eminem with the mic. So For example, I can use these helpers from Vuex and use the spread operator to map actions into the local scope of the component. So, for example, whenever I call load article here, this will actually code the load action from Vuex. And then whenever a state is changed in Vuex, for example, let's say I have a new article, I need the various components need to wait for that state to monitor that state change and act accordingly. So, for example, in the breadcrumbs, I need to display the current node. In the menu, the current article is selected. In the content, I need to actually display the content, and in the main application, I need to maybe update the title tag of the element. And basically, I have another helper called map state, and allows me to import state from, I have these 3 state variables, allows me to import them into the current in my component scope by using the spread operator. And then I can just add watchers. Again, in Vue, everything is watchable. And so far, Vue kind of delivers whatever I wanted from a framework. And, well, getting started with Vue, 1 minute, I promise. You can start I know you're German, you can start the time now. To get started, it's really easy. Vue provides a generic tool that allows you to bootstrap projects really fast, so you can just install it as a generic package. And then you call Vue init, you have multiple templates, Webpack and Browserify. Remember, don't use Browserify. And then you specify the name of your project. And this starts a skeleton project with everything set up, tests, and so on. There are some dev tools that you can use in the browser for Chrome, and it allows you to inspect the state and your components in real time, and some resources that you can look and find more about Vue and plugins. And thank you. Was it 1 minute?
Thank you very much. You're a bit over time, but if there's 1 or 2 questions, that's okay. Any questions? No? One question, okay. Can you take this microphone here for answers?
What other frameworks did you look at before settling on Vue?
React, and Angular 1, and jQuery.
Last question. Hi. Good talk, by the way. So when you looked at React, did it have the licensing issues?
I'm sorry?
When you looked at React, did it have the licensing issues you were talking about?
If React had the licensing?
Yes, when you looked at it. You mentioned in your previous answer that you looked at React, and I'm asking whether when you looked at it...
It had. I think like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago,
I know.
They changed back, and they're using the MIT, I think, licensing model. What I didn't like about React was the JSX, because it made it difficult. For example, in Vue, I can just give the template to the designer and say, dude, this is pure HTML. You cannot, don't put anything here that looks like JavaScript and it will work. Whereas in the JSX, I can't really give that to the designer. And also with a bit of Webpack magic, I can move the template in a different file that I can give it completely to the designer. Whereas in, I don't like designers touching my code.
Okay, thank you, Tudor. Now, yeah.